feels Orwellian. It feels like I'm living in a dystopia where journalists are being arrested.
NewsClick journalists have been detained by Delhi police.
9 police persons came to my home.
Intimidated for speaking truth to power to save the constitutional values.
In Saudi Arabia, daring to speak up to your rights is treated as a crime.
Just like the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the level of torture and brutality has no limit in Saudi Arabia today, especially since MBS came to power.
If you're a dissident in Rwanda, you can go to jail, get imprisoned, get killed. And on top of that, my father has a platform that President Kagame doesn't like.
We are living in a time when journalists are the new enemies of the state, more so in India, where the world's largest democracy is descending in some kind of a police state.
This is a tool that autocrats are using to stop dissidents, to put people away, to silence activists. And it's happening all over the world. And so it's very important that we continue this fight.
Good afternoon. I'm Jason Rezine. I'm a global opinions writer here at The Washington Post. I'm really pleased today to be joined on the stage with global opinions contributing writer for The Post, my dear friend Rana Ayyub, who's visiting from India, Rwandan-born human rights defender, also good friend, Anaïse Kanimba, and Areej al-Sadhan, new friend, a Saudi-American human rights activist. Thank you for joining us for a very important conversation. I want to welcome you all, but before we get started, I'd also like to recognize a dear friend of mine who is with us today, the Iranian photojournalist Yalda Moayari, who is here, right here. I just want to tell you a quick bit about her. She was arrested in Tehran last year during the anti-government protests following the death of Mahsa Amini in custody that sparked a year of protests throughout Iran. She has been in and out of prison over the years for speaking truth to power. She is one of my first collaborators from my time in Iran. She was also our wedding photographer, so it's a really wonderful thing for her to be here today. I want to start by asking all of you to briefly share a bit about your own personal stories and what brought you here today. Rana, as you know better than anybody else, India has fallen to one of the lowest press freedom rankings in the world, a country that has more newspaper readers on a daily basis than there are citizens of the United States of America. It's a particularly startling fact that a once thriving democracy has fallen so far. What's it like to be a journalist, a woman journalist, a Muslim woman journalist in Narendra Modi's India today?
Well, thank you, Jason. Thank you to each one of you. You know, it's a tough time convincing people in the world that India, the world's largest democracy, can be a predator of the press, of press freedom. I go back to India in the next 10 days to face 3 trials in a span of 1 week. Every time I have to leave India, I have to basically get court permission. I've been stopped at the airports from flying out. There's a threat to my life. But more than that, Jason, I mean, of course, what Jason has introduced, the fact that I'm a journalist, I'm a woman, a Muslim woman who is critical of the Modi government, a man who is practicing a majoritarian politics that we have not witnessed so far in a democracy like India, who's feted by the world over, including in the United States, as some kind of a bulwark to China, right? We always say India should be the bulwark against China, but while being the bulwark against China, we are resembling China right now. As Jason said, we are on the 162nd position in the World Press Freedom Index. 3 weeks before I got here, the Modi government raided a news organization called the NewsClick. And young journalists, 21, 22-year-old interns, had income tax, enforcement directorate officials, top cops at their doorstep early in the morning, confiscating their gadgets, confiscating their laptops. That's the life of a journalist in India, right? And that's the story that the world needs to know, that the world's largest democracy is slipping down under. And it is our responsibility collectively to talk about countries where we believe that press freedom might not be, or human rights might not be in the position that the world expects. We are on paper a secular, inclusive, plural democracy, but we are far from it as we see it right now.
Thank you for that. I want to draw your attention to this image. This is a full-page ad that we ran in support of Rana a year or so ago when she was facing one of her many trials in India. It's part of the Washington Post Press Freedom Partnership, where we really try and stand up for journalists in trouble around the world through a group of community organizations that focus on these issues. Anaïse, people in the audience and at home may know your story a bit and that of your dad's, Paul Rusesabagina. But the part of the story that didn't make it into the film Hotel Rwanda is about your dad being abducted and arrested back in Rwanda. You and your sister were adopted by Paul in 1994. You later worked tirelessly, along with your sister, to campaign for his release. As a matter of fact, it was just over a year ago that you and I met downstairs in the coffee shop to strategize on ways about getting the story more attention. Your dad is now, thankfully, home. He saved your life, and then you and your sister worked to save his. Talk about that experience.
Thank you, Jason, and hi, everyone. Yes, so I was a survivor of the Rwandan genocide in 1994. Both my parents, who were Tutsi, were killed in the very first day of the genocide. And my sister and I, that you see over here, Karine, were very fortunate to be adopted by my aunt and my uncle, Paul and Tatiana Rusesabagina. We had a seamlessly beautiful childhood. We grew up in Belgium and then came to the United States. But it was seemingly beautiful because instead of that, because we were running away from our country. Even though we thought we were safe, we were not actually safe because the Rwandan government was persecuting my father and anybody who spoke against him or spoke the truth of what's happening in Rwanda. The movie Hotel Rwanda gave him a platform to talk about these human rights violations constantly happening in Rwanda. The fact that there's a dictatorship in Rwanda, there is no freedom of speech in Rwanda. Many crimes have been committed in the DRC because of the current regime in Rwanda. And those are the things that my father was saying that displeased the dictatorship. And that led him into being kidnapped in 2020. He was here in Texas, actually, during the pandemic. And the government did a crazy, almost could be another movie. They lured him to Dubai and then took him against his will to Kigali, and he woke up not knowing where he was and a place where he knew he was going to be killed right away. And this is when my sister and I found out on August 31st, 2020, that our father was in jail and in Rwanda. And so we were very lucky to meet many people in Washington, D.C., and Jason, but also people realized that in Rwanda, the story that they've been hearing was not the actual story. What happened to my father is actually what's happening to many Rwandans on a daily basis. Anybody who speaks the truth, who says what the government doesn't want to hear, finds themselves in prison. And often they don't have any due process, and they languish in there without any hope of being able to be released. And sadly, this is happening when Rwanda is one of the biggest partners of the United States in the EU. And so there's a big disconnect of having partners like Rwanda who are kidnapping people, who are imprisoning political activists in general. And we hope that my father's story can show to the world that Rwanda is what it is, and things can change very quickly.
Thank you. Thank you. I unfortunately know a little bit about what it means to exercise your freedom of expression in places where that's not respected. I was the Post bureau chief in Tehran. 2014, I was arrested. I spent a year and a half in prison, finally released after many efforts by the US government. This newspaper and others but it was a long and difficult process. Areej, your brother Abdul Rahman was arrested in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia in 2018, and he remains in prison now. Can you give us a kind of background on what led to his arrest and what his current status is at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So my brother, a dear friend to me and a very wonderful brother and son, humanitarian aid worker, he was kidnapped from his office where he worked at the Red Cross headquarters office in Riyadh. And without a warrant, he was taken away. And since then, we weren't able to find any information on his whereabouts or why they took him and or what was his condition. And although we tried to reach out, my family in Riyadh tried to reach out to the secret police office where we heard that they are the ones who took him. They kept denying any knowledge until a full month of trying. Then they finally acknowledged that they did have him. But even though they acknowledged that they did have him, they denied us any knowledge or communication with him. That happened during a mass crackdown on peaceful activists and online critics of the government in Saudi Arabia in 2018. The situation continued of his enforced disappearance, denying us any contact, denying us any knowledge of my brother, until 2 years later, after international pressure, he was allowed a 1-minute phone call where at least we got to somehow confirm that he's still alive. And then from that point, he got disappeared again for another year. So it was 3 years of being held without a charge. Then he was brought to a sham secret trial. And again, because of international pressure, he was brought to a secret sham trial only to be sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, followed by 20 years travel ban for tweeting. So, and during the time he was imprisoned, we weren't completely in the dark. We used to receive information from witnesses that he'd been brutally tortured. He was held in solitary confinement for years. He was tortured with electric shocks, beating, sleep deprivation. They broke his hand, smashed his fingers, saying, "This is the hand you tweet with." I mean, he ended up in the intensive care unit for days, more than 5 days, fighting for his life, unconscious. Unfortunately, my brother continued to be forcibly disappeared until today, even though after the sentencing, we weren't allowed any communication again afterwards. We weren't allowed any phone calls or visits, no matter how many times my family tried in Riyadh. All the requests have been either ignored or denied. I mean, after he'd been sentenced, again, we had no communication. I mean, this just tells you how the situation in Saudi Arabia, my brother's not the only one. There are thousands of other activists, and not only activists, they're just people who are, tweeting or commenting on situation, on the, things that are happening in Saudi Arabia about unemployment or their struggle to find a job or women's situation. There are women activists who've been imprisoned and tortured, and even though after international pressure they got released, they're still under house arrest. They can't leave the country. So unfortunately, just last year, the United Nations have actually declared that my brother is wrongfully and unlawfully arbitrarily detained and called for his release, immediate release and unconditional release. Yet the Saudi government haven't responded, and they continue to deprive us from any communication at all.
Thank you for sharing those very painful details about his situation. It strikes me that that these three governments have a couple of things in common. One, incredible abuses of power against individual citizens, but also very cozy relations with the United States of America. In all three cases, they rely on the U.S. for financial assistance, military assistance, security aid. Rana, I want to ask you, what do you expect from the U.S. government on these human rights issues, in particular in India, but around the world?
Well, the United States has its own Committee for Religious Freedom, which releases its annual report on religious freedom. And every year, the United States itself, in its own State Department, releases a very scathing report on the abuse of minorities, Muslim minorities in India. The same State Department. So it's not like President Biden or Secretary Tony Blinken is not aware of what's happening in India. It's like they know what is happening, and they still give him the highest state honors, right? And they still give it, but they give him all kinds of, he was a state guest, and we saw the kind of, it would not surprise you that the Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy, Narendra Modi, has not held a single press conference in the last 9 years in power. It has never happened in India before, the world's largest democracy. The only time he was subjected to a question was when he was at the White House 2 months ago, and when the journalist Sabrina Siddiqui from Wall Street Journal actually asked him a question on democratic rights and human rights. That journalist was subjected to a virtual lynch mob, after which the White House had to give a statement. Just one question in 9 years, and that's a repercussion. You can only imagine what journalists like us are going through on a daily basis. So I believe that the US is very well aware of what India is doing, what Saudi Arabia is doing, or for that matter, many dictatorships are doing. We are very unpopular dictators. Everybody knows that there's dictatorship, that it fulfills all the indices or characteristics of a dictatorship. It's just that we are not willing to call out those dictatorships because our own strategic interests. So real politics, at the end of the day, dominates human rights and democratic rights. When anybody questions Narendra Modi government about journalists like us who are being, attacked in the way that we are, and a lot of government officials will be like, oh, but she is speaking at platforms, right? She's speaking at international platforms. Who's stopping them? Who's stopping people like me? The thing is, when you don't kill a journalist, when you don't jail a journalist, there are ways in which you silence a journalist. We call it death by 1,000 cuts, right? I spent more time fighting court cases than doing my reportage, and that for me is the ultimate humiliation of a journalist. I have my bank accounts frozen. The easier way out is to make peace with the government, which I'm not going to do over my dead body, because some of us have the unpopular job of documenting what's happening in India, in the world's largest democracy, and that's the price we pay for speaking truth to power. So if anything, the United States needs to speak up for human rights, which it believes it stands up for, but I don't think it's walking the talk on this. And I don't expect them to do much. As truth be told, I don't expect them to do much on this.
I want to pose a question to both Anaïse and Areej. Both Saudi Arabia and Rwanda have invested a lot of capital, a lot of time, a lot of energy into reforming their images around the world. The experiences of both of your families and many other people in both countries tells a very different story. Are these attempts working? I'm not going to ask if the reforms are real. Are the attempts to reform the image working? And if they are, how can we counteract those?
I believe it's working, and I think that's the scary part, is because it's working and we're being lied to, knowing we're being lied to, and we're turning the other cheek, and that's the problem. In Rwanda, for instance, the government, it's a dictatorship. We have an election again next year, and President Kagame is going to run again by himself, and that will give him over 30 years of power in one country. And this is the kind of story that we hear every single day from different dictatorships. People stay in power, and they use the system that we value here to lie that they actually are doing reforms. And for our specific case in Rwanda, Rwanda practice transnational oppression. They use Pegasus on my sister and my cousin to follow us and to try to track us, to know our every single move. Those are things that are not allowed in the United States, and we have tools to deter these kind of behaviors when we see, but we just choose not to use them. And instead, we allow ourselves to listen to these lies, which I call lies, that they call reforms, but these are lies that we're being told. And we have to stand up to the truth and say the truth.
Yeah, I agree. It's working to some extent, but I don't think it's working exactly like. At the same time, it's actually shining a light on the human rights abuses, because a lot of these abuses are fresh. For example, the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, I know it's not as prominent as before, but still it keeps coming up because obviously the issue was never resolved. I mean, the case of Jamal Khashoggi still live with us every day because the abuses are ongoing. The issue was never solved. Freedom of speech is completely forbidden in Saudi Arabia. So I think it all depends also to world leaders who are the ones who actually allow it to succeed, like all this whitewashing, sport washing. If they're not helping the international communities, human rights organizations to actually support our call for human rights, then they are allowing these dictators to win with their sport washing and entertainment.
Doesn't it also require people in those industries, in sports and entertainment, taking a stand?
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is one of the things, once they are educated about, they are aware of these human rights abuses, they should be taking a stand and actually making their stand clear on human rights. Even if they still want to go to Saudi Arabia and do business, that's fine. But can you ask about human rights? Can you ask about individual cases? Can you ask to go see and visit the prisoners? You do have the power. Celebrities and sports stars do have the power to make a change, to help us. So if you decide to go to Saudi Arabia, please do help us. Ask about human rights. Ask about why Abdurrahman, my brother, a humanitarian aid worker, is still forcibly disappeared, a son of an American. Why women rights activists are not allowed to leave the country? Why are they still on travel ban? I mean, these are very simple, basic questions that you have the power to do and to help us.
Anaïse, one follow-up for you. I mean, Rwanda relies on the U.S. government for how much in aid every year?
I think almost over 100 million.
Which is a massive amount for their budget. Mm-hmm. During the time of advocating for your dad, did you see any movement by the U.S. government to maybe suspend any of that aid? And was it something that they would even entertain doing?
Yes, they were. Let me take a step back. During our advocacy, we always made sure that any kind of aid that was humanitarian would not be cut, because we understand that what the government is doing should not be, the people of Rwanda should not be victim of what the government is doing. They're already victim to begin with. And so we were very sure that the aid would continue, but we made sure that the aid that does not go to humanitarian issues will be questioned. Rwanda is a military ally to the United States. You cannot have a military ally that's using national security tools like Pegasus and others on American citizens. How is the money being used? And so these are the kind of questions we need to understand, and how this relationship, which I believe are uneven and unequal partnerships. And the United States has the right and should stand up to the human rights abuses happening in Rwanda, and should not continue to aid the country in giving them more money in the military and other places like that.
The toolkit for dictators is vast, and it is often very targeted, but it's also often quite blunt. Rana, can you talk about some of the ways that the Modi government has taken to quash dissent, in addition to putting you through legal trials over periods of years? What are other things that they're doing on a massive level?
Well, at this point of time, some of India's best-known human rights activists, student activists, are all behind bars. Some of our finest lawyers are behind bars. Some of our best human rights defenders are behind bars. Washington Post has itself done an exhaustive investigation on how Pegasus is being used on journalists, activists, and how evidence is being planted on human rights activists who are critical of the Modi government. And based on that evidence that is being planted on their laptops and phones, those journalists or those activists are behind bars. At this point of time, we used to have the most robust press, but at this point of time, we have a press that speaks the language of the Modi government. So what are the bastions of what are the contours of a democracy? Is that your free press should speak truth to power. This is the panel about truth to power. The most disappointing bit is that Modi government has co-opted independent journalism. He has silenced independent journalism. He is using surveillance. Pegasus has been, has been used on dissenters and critics. Our human rights activists are behind bars. So there are very, very few people who are left to do the critical speaking. At this point of time, earlier when I used to speak on international forums, I would not feel the fear. But some of us are self-censoring ourselves because we don't know whatever language, whatever speech that we give internationally is going to be used against us once we go back home. So I think a lot of us are self-censoring ourselves. We don't even have the platforms that we used to have earlier to speak about the Modi government.
Thank you. This has been a vitally important conversation. I appreciate all of you for joining us. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time. We have to wrap there. I want to point out, I'm not Sally Jenkins. But you should read her work. She's fantastic. And you should read mine. And you should subscribe to the Washington Post.
Can I have just one last one? Because this is a panel
really
on truth to power. Just one last line,
Please,
though.
say it.
We must speak for journalists in Palestine. They are fighting an unpopular battle. This is about truth to power. Almost 45 journalists have been killed. In any other part of the world, if that many number of journalists would have been killed, there would be outrage. We need to show solidarity with those journalists. That's all. Thank you so much.
Please stay with us. Our executive editor, Sally Busby, will be out here next for a conversation with 3 other women at the helm of major news organizations. Wait for it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.